Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone who is on site, and those who are on Zoom, and those who are watching via the Facebook. Thank you for those who are on site. Thank you for coming all the way to EdUHK. My name is Isabella, and I am the Assistant Professor and Associate Head for Teaching and Learning in the Department of Asian and Policy Studies. So welcome to the third episode of the Policy Dialogue series, jointly organized by the Department of Asian and Policy Studies, the Academy of Hong Kong Studies in the Education University of Hong Kong, and the Division of Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Today's topic is giving hope to young people, what matters and how. So in the past two episodes, we looked at several possibilities. And the first episode looked at the possibility to break away from the COVID impasse. The second episode was about the possibility of striking a balance between development and environment for a sustainable future. So this time we're looking at another possibility, the possibility of giving hope to the young generation and what matters and how. In the introduction, we mentioned about the recent survey conducted by the Hong Kong Federation of Youth, and we saw that only 37.9% of the participants, they were feeling hopeful about their own prospects, and 46.9% are pessimistic about the future of Hong Kong. So what we're trying to investigate today is whether the Hong Kong government's initiative on boosting the morale of the Hong Kong youth, and whether it would be just a wishful thinking or whether it is actually a promising policy for the future of the youth. So joining us today, we are very, very thrilled to have three heavyweights on policy making, shaking and shaping. So we have Mr. Brian Wong, who is a Rhodes Scholar and DPhil candidate of politics in the University of Oxford. And he is the founding editor-in-chief of the Oxford Political Review and a regular columnist in Time, South China Morning Post, and The Diplomat. And then, of course, we have Professor Tai-lok, and who is the director of the Academy of Hong Kong Studies and the chair professor of Hong Kong Studies in the Education University of Hong Kong. And he is also the former vice president of research and development in our university. And needless to say, we have Professor Anthony Cheung, who is the adjunct research chair professor of public management in the EdUHK, and also the adjunct professor in the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He's the former secretary of transport and housing, and also our former president. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have 20 minutes for each speaker to present their ideas, and followed by Q&A. And for those who are interested in giving their comments, questions, for those who are on site, you are very welcome to raise a hand and let us know what your thoughts or your questions. For those who are on Zoom, please write on the chat box, right, Johnny? Write on the chat box, and so that we can collect your questions and comments. And for those who are watching on Facebook, please PM us or leave your comments on the comment columns. So without further delay, we would like to invite Professor Anthony Cheung to start, please. Anthony, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabella, for the kind introduction. The topic of today's discussion is giving hope to young people. And now this is the theme of the current SAR government. And most recently, just last month, the government has promulgated a youth development blueprint in which over 160 initiatives were launched. So given the current emphasis on young people, so I'll try to understand what are we trying to deal with this very significant theme in mind. Let me speak to the PowerPoint. On the 25th anniversary of the SAR, President Xi Jinping made a very important what is known as a major address on the 1st of July. And among the issues he talked about is to give hope for the younger generation. So here I've highlighted the part regarding young people, the original Chinese version, and also in term for those who don't understand Chinese, the major point is, he said, we must pay special attention to and care for young people. Hong Kong will prosper only when its young people thrive. And ever since July, this target or this theme has become a focus of the current administration. The blueprint promulgated at the end of December last year is about how to give young people hope and how to define the focus of youth work for the current government. And here I quote from the blueprint, the objective is to nurture a new generation of young people with an affection for our country and Hong Kong, and equipped with global perspectives, an aspiring mindset, and positive thinking. So all the good things, all the desirable things are there, so that our young people on the same, they will be proud of, they will have affection for the country, Hong Kong, and also they will have global perspectives. The other point is about providing young people with an enabling environment to cherish hope for the future, to strive for continuous growth so that they can unleash their full potential to in society and contribute to Hong Kong, the country, and the world. So to provide an opportunity for them to fully realize their potential to contribute to Hong Kong, China, and the world. Now, I'm not going into the detail, but you can see from this chart the 4 pillars or themes of the development blueprint, and also the nature of programs and activities to be covered respectively by the 4 pillars. The 4 pillars are exploration, hope, empowerment, and contribution. Very strong words, including the original version in Chinese. But if you can see the broad range of activities, programs that will be launched by the government under this new youth development blueprint. And by the way, the government has also designated one of the deputy secretaries for Home and Youth Affairs, who is in charge of youth affairs, to be the youth commissioner. So you can see the efforts being made by the government to emphasize how important the younger generation is for Hong Kong and what government will do. And this youth commissioner will also coordinate efforts by various policy bureaus and departments. So this is going to be a coordinated campaign, sort of, to enable the young people to contribute and to see a future in Hong Kong. So as I said, in the blueprint, all the good things, all the nice things about what is to be done. Now, but whether this direction can fully address the youth problem depends on how we understand the youth problem. So let me go to the other sort of extreme in terms of images. Now, this is a report by the BBC News back in June 2019, and we all know what 2019 means for Hong Kong. And this is a very sort of impactful picture in that report. It's about the extradition protests, about the radicalization of young people. And what the BBC has captured, and I'm quoting directly from the BBC News at that day on the 17th of June, at the forefront of these demonstrations are young people, many barely out of their teens. Why did they get involved? And then so on and so forth. So the major question, I think, is why so many young people, some barely out of the teens, got involved in the protest? And what is the protest about? I think if we try to understand the youth issue, I won't use the term problem, but if we try to understand the nature of the youth issue, we need to go back to 2019 and understand why. There might be general explanations, and there might be more specific explanations about 2019. If we look deeper into the theory of young people, I would use the term the 3D generation to capture the key issues. 3D representing dispossessed, disenfranchisement, and disillusion. Young people feel they are dispossessed. They're discontent about the status quo. They feel that they have better education, and yet they have less opportunity or less mobility. They have this sense of insecurity about their present situation, housing affordability, social mobility, and the less sense of insecurity about the future. Their resentment, therefore, towards the political environment, the political regime, if you like, the growing sense of alienation, anti-establishment, anti-repression, in the way they put it. So in other words, they're so unhappy about the present situation as they see it, and they blame all these problems, issues on the system in very broad terms for all these problems. And they blame, therefore, the root of the system. They blame the basic law, they blame the one country, two systems arrangement. Some even say that ask why their predecessors, their parent generation or their grandparents have accepted one country, two systems. And there is this sense of loss of identity. Identity politics is nothing new, it's everywhere around the world. But in the unique situation of Hong Kong, it has to do with one country, two systems. How you identify yourselves in Hong Kong that is within China, and how do you see it, the future, the present situation, the future of China, so on and so forth. And from the sentiments expressed in 2019, there seems to be a loss of confidence in the city. And I can also see a rather contradictory coexistence of idealism and fatalism underneath those sentiments. On the one hand, those protesters, young people, they have great passion for Hong Kong. They want to achieve grand things, they have grand schemes. But on the other hand, you can sense this feeling of being impotent, fatalism, that nothing could be done. I mean, this two extremes coexisted at the same time in 2019. So that is something we need to look deeper into and to find out why before we are able to really address the real problem. So are we in a youth crisis? Now, of course, I don't want to give the impression that our young people are the problem. So I try to be more detached, but we must focus on what they did, what they're doing, and what they've been thinking. But many observers perhaps might agree that many of our younger generation are not optimistic about the future. Now, Isabella just then cited the result of a survey done by the youth think tank EdUHK of the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups. And according to that survey, actually a majority, they don't feel optimistic about Hong Kong, the future of Hong Kong. Although maybe quite a significant portion feel they are more optimistic about their own personal future. So again, rather contradictory kind of finding. Now, why did young people rebel? Rebel might be a strong word, but I'm using it in a more generic sense. They're not happy, they want to make change, they want to overturn something to do with the existing arrangement. Why did they rebel in 2019? According to police figures, 40% of those arrested for unrest in that year were students, young people. And nearly 20% were under the age of 18. Now that's quite alarming figure. Why were they radicalized and becoming extreme, even accepting violence at that time? Now, there could be all kinds of explanations. I'm not going into a very detailed analysis of 2019. But it's interesting to, and here I put up a remark made by a judge when sentencing 8 young protesters of the 2019 PolyU siege in November 2019. And the judge said, I'm not saying I agree with him or not agree with him. I'm just using that remark as a point of observation that these protesters, according to the judge, in quotation, and here I quote him, they were not evil, but were influenced by a polarized society. So what is meant by a polarized society at that time? Why was society being polarized? I think these are more fundamental issues. Now, the government has put a lot of emphasis on addressing the problems of study, employment, entrepreneurship, and home ownership. In Chinese, 學業、就業、創業、置業, the 四業 of young people. But I think definitely these 4 aspects are important to young people. But it's more than that, because I think young people have other pursuits as well. So it's not just about the economy. It has to do with politics as well. It has to do with ideals, the vision of society. And in very broad terms, we could say that the younger generation here in Hong Kong as elsewhere, they all want to take an active part in building a fair and progressive society. Fair according to their way of looking at things, progressive again according to their aspirations, a society that they can be proud of. And this, I think, is nothing unusual, because I would argue that this is the aspiration on every generation when they were young. So I'm also talking about myself when I was in my teens and 20s. And the kind of youth discontent and alienation experienced in Hong Kong is not something unique to Hong Kong. You can sense that everywhere. And here I have a rather interesting picture. So the Woodstock generation, when the Woodstock generation was in their teens and 20s, and when they were in their 60s and 70s, right? Now, this is definitely from the US, this comic picture. So the baby boomers versus the millennials, right? Now, this generation gap is very significant in Hong Kong, in North America, in Europe, and other countries. So that would be one angle of looking at things. But I will also extend that notion of generational gap to the generational gap between government and young people. Because my experience when I was in government, and also my observation now, is within government, those who are more involved in policy making, they tend to be much older. In terms of bureaucrats, probably they are already in their 50s. And if you look at the current team of ministers, again, rather elderly, according to the young people. Because for young people, anyone beyond 30, beyond 40, they're so old. And there was this saying that don't trust anyone beyond 30 during the Woodstock generation. So the gap affects how people understand things. Now, again, another rather thought-provoking slide. Who stole our future? The question being asked by the younger generation. So here I've highlighted two books. One with the title, The Theft of a Decade. The other with the title, Stop Mugging Grandma. Okay, so those who are interested, you can look, you can read the two books. But again, this feeling of being, having their future stolen by the parents, grandparent generation is not unique. So here I cited the title of an article published in Marxism Today in the UK in November 1918. The title was Youth in the 80s, a Dispossessed Generation. So we are talking about recurring themes, although the context, of course, is different. And the context varies across generations and also across systems, societies. So in the case of Hong Kong, perhaps we can understand more specifically what is being at stake. If you look around the world, the sense of being alienated seems to be triggered by the sense of fear, the fear of the unknown, fear of the other, fear of the future, particularly for young people. And in Sigmund Bauman's book, Globalization, the Human Consequences, he argues about the more adverse economic, social, and cultural consequences of globalization and their entanglement with national, regional, and local contexts. And the term he used, Unsicherheit, in German, this complex combination of uncertainty, insecurity, and lack of safety. So the same or similar notion could be applied to understanding the situation in Hong Kong. Now, the study conducted by the youth think tank of the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups, you can look up the website and you can see the details. So I'm not going to talk about the details here, but it's important to note that I'm referring to 2.1 and 2.2 on this slide. According to 2.1, 37.9% of the youth respondents, they feel positive, I think, about their personal prospects, but then nearly half, so 46.9%, they are pessimistic about the future of Hong Kong. And it's also interesting to note from 2.2 here that because the respondents were asked about what they believe to be the core values, important core values. And according to the results in terms of order of priority, freedom, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and inclusiveness, tolerance. Again, the finding is not new to us because that has been, seems to be the sentiments in recent years. So when we talk about enhancing our youth work, trying to address their anxiety, their discontent, how can we relate what we are doing, we meaning government, NGOs, society at large, how can we relate what we are trying to do to such findings, assuming the findings have some basis? What is missing? I'm not saying that we are missing particular things. I'm trying to pose that as a question. I would say it's the P word. P meaning, what do young people care about personally? What do young people care about politically? And I'm using this phrase, the personal is political. And this is a slogan for the youth protest movement in the late 1960s and also the feminist movement in the West. The personal is political. According to that argument, yes, we have all kinds of personal problems, issues, but ultimately the way to deal with those issues must be political intervention, changing the system. That was the sort of radical thought behind the slogan in those days. So can we sort of draw some inspiration from that kind of understanding to what we try to do today? We know that our young people, they're not confident, they fear about the future, and we try to do something. And in trying to do something, I would like to use Herzberg's two-factor theory to help us diagnose or help us understand what kind of initiatives we should launch. Now, according to the two-factor theory, we have both hygiene factors, the maintenance factors to ensure that you have the necessary foundation. But in order to motivate achievement, you need motivating factors, which are different from hygiene factors. And I would say that material improvement benefits the so-called 四業, study, employment, home ownership, all these things, they relate more to material improvement and benefits. They are the maintenance factors. They provide the green pastures, if you like. But we have to provide motivating factors for our young people. They need a sense of self-worth and self-realization. So contributing to society is not just expressing their views. They need to take part. They want to be part of the process to foster a fair society and to have a stake in it. And this is, if you look at the government document, well, you can sense, well, this is in the document in some way. Are we able to really achieve that? And would the young people really appreciate what is being done? So we have to remove what they fear and to enhance their sense of ownership. And given that the core values that they pursue are freedom, democracy, rule of law, and all that, are these core values still defining features of our city? So to sum up my presentation at this point, we have to re-engage the younger generation. And it's not just to enable them, helping them to find hope and future. I think we have to really consider and accept that they are the future. So how we enable the younger generation to grow, the opportunity to be provided, will shape their future, and their future will be Hong Kong's future. Or if we look at it more widely, the nation's future is part of China. So who am I? The question of who am I? The past shaped what young people feel who they are today, but what kind of future can we provide? And that will shape also how they feel today. China, the world, what they expect from China, what they expect from the world. So it's not just, so we need to understand what they feel about the nation, what they feel about the world. So it's more multidimensional. One country, two systems obviously is something has to be addressed. And we need to enable them to see that Hong Kong will continue to be a city with distinctness, a city that they will be proud of. We have to address the 3D question. We have to address core values, that the core values are still important to the sense of citizenship, at least in Hong Kong. And they can also see a political future for Hong Kong, not just the economic future, but also a political future for Hong Kong. And political future doesn't mean just elections and political institutions, the wider sense of the P word. But certainly the prospect of democracy should be there. So I will stop here. I hope that I've provided some angles that can enable us to discuss further later. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Isabel, and thanks to Anthony for opening this very important and interesting discussion on giving hope to young people. My presentation probably shift the focus a little bit, because when I look at the topic, I tend to look at it not just seeing the government's response should be just a reaction to what happened in 2019, and seeing, young people being probably the most problematic phenomenon of that part of Hong Kong's history, and so we need to do something about young people. So probably you can criticize me of decontextualizing youth policies, but at the same time, I'm arguing that we need to recontextualize our discussion of young people in an even broader agenda. The second thing is I shift it a bit because I'm more interested in the issue about how. It is kind of easy for us to cook up a tall list of potential policy initiatives and things that we want to do and capture them with 4 big words and 8 major policies, that sort of thing. And now in every policy domain, we're coming up with all these big words. But, are we really carrying out some sort of engaging discussion and dialogue with young people? I think that probably would be far more important. And that is the starting point of my presentation, is that this is probably my own perception. But for a long time, quite honestly, I tend to think that very few government policies, not just confining to policies about young people, in a lot of areas, very few of them are really in dialogue with, I underline the word, ordinary young people. It's very easy for us to come up with, a big map saying the future generation should be should have global perspective. You should reach out to Greater Bay Area, Belt and Road, and if you allow me to amend it as well, I would say Greater Bay Area, Belt and Road, and the rest of the world. I mean, for young people, why should you just focus in one place or 2 places? You should go anywhere. At the same time, you'll probably say something like, okay, then you'll become entrepreneurial, you would be self-motivating, a tall list of all these attributes. But when they add up, I don't think that, this is the profile of an ordinary guy that I would meet in the street. Of course, you would say that, how come you can tolerate this kind of people? You should turn all these people into future elites and so on. We'll come back to that later on. But the first point I want to make is most of the time that, we pay very little attention to the concerns of ordinary people, especially ordinary young people. Of course, I have encountered friends that would talk back to me and say that no. Definitely the government is well conscious of diversities. We are well aware of ethnicity, we are well aware of gender differences, age differences, social class backgrounds, all sorts of things. So this is the reason why that, diversity is now being introduced into a lot of discussions and so on. But my impression is that, very rarely have we really taken up diversity and to really embed it, diversities into policy initiatives and proposals. So when we say giving hope, I would like to change the way that we look at it and to change the agenda. Instead of giving hope in a singular expression, I would say that, it has to be plural. I mean, hopes for you may be very different from the hope of mine, or what constitutes a hope for people of my generation, of my education background, may be very different from even a university graduate nowadays. And we do need to allow for people to pursue hopes, different kinds of hopes, along different pathways. We're just providing them with facilitators and facilitating conditions so that they can make it and do it. The reason why I underline the plural form of hopes is because quite often, again, going back to policy initiatives, a lot of time I get the impression is that, all these proposals are really talking to the top 25%. I'm not necessarily talking about, the people who have the highest scores in DSE or in terms of university degree, but in terms of their overall profile. Basically, you're talking to the top tier. And only those people probably would make sense of the proposal and think that, all these initiatives in front of them would be something realizable and meaningful. Whereas for other people, as I would show in other examples in the following discussion, it probably is something not even reachable. So this is something that we would need to be aware of when we think about, we now want to talk to young people. They will ask you, are you really talking to me? And I don't think that there's an easy answer to the question that I just raised. Because in the past, I think 5, 6, 10 years, a lot of time when we talk about young people, education, employment, and that sort of thing, then nowadays a lot of people will come up with the counter proposal and saying, okay, yeah, we shouldn't push young people just along the pathway of getting a university degree. So why not reviving vocational training? Why not, we allow them to pick up skills, and as a result that, they don't need to do too much grammar-like courses and look forward to university campus as their future. Of course, this sort of response is, I would say, positive, and it's further developed into the notion of having multiple pathways, which definitely is important and is, beneficial to young people. But having said that, a lot of time in Hong Kong, we have to recognize and to admit that this society is not a society ready to pay people taking up skillful but manual work. Say, for example, maintaining elevators. Well, it's not the lowest pay in the world, but at the same time, the pay package is not very attractive. In Hong Kong nowadays, we have a lot of sectors saying that, the pay package, the whole rewarding system is not conducive to recruit young people into that industry, into this kind of job. And most of the time, people just make that statement, finish the sentence, and move on, without going back and think, then how come? If we think that job actually is quite important, shouldn't we revise the pay package in order to attract young people? Of course, the discussion would easily spill over into other areas, saying that's the younger generation. They never take up hard job, they never take up challenging jobs. They just want to have a good life. Anything with fun mobile games, that would be good enough. So that's why even if you revise the pay package, they won't get into that kind of industry. Is this really the case? Have we really looked into all these things seriously? And the point I want to make is, in Hong Kong society, not only in one or two kind of jobs, in many types of jobs, the reward structure actually have certain kind of biases. We tend to think that, if you highly educated, work in finance, commercial area, professional services, you should be highly rewarded because you are really the talent. But if you are doing some kind of job which is very important for our safety, maintaining the elevator, but which seems to be not sophisticated enough because it's more technical, even though there are not many people are ready to take it up, I'm not going to increase your salary because, this is not the sort of talent we have in mind. I do think that, this is one big problem in our mindset and our thinking, and also the overall arrangement of an environment that would be friendly and conducive to young people. So as a result, in Hong Kong, we end up with a very interesting situation that both young people and their parents, I would think sometimes irrationally, because for some unknown reason, we love university degrees. For me, it's good news, of course. I receive my salary because of university education, or providing university education. But on the other side of it is the way that, this is the only meaningful, future-oriented pathway for human development. I would, have a question mark. But having said that, you also need to admit that this sort of response is also very rational, because seriously, if you really do some statistical analysis, you will find out that even up to now, having a university degree is still, in the long run, would secure higher return. So having a degree or not having a degree is still making a difference. So as a result, we end up with most of our DSE students would still work out a lot of ways. Finally, the destination should still be a university. This is the way, and so as a result, we created a kind of mono track. Everyone stuck in the same way, doing the same kind of competition, feeling uneasy, and so on and so forth. It is an impasse in the sense that, as I said, it's both irrational and rational, because it did make sense in terms of how to secure a better outcome. But at the same time, even though that you are not quite ready for, university education, you will still be pushed towards that direction, whether you like it or not. So how to get out of it? I think that it requires a major operation, and operations that complements what Anthony has just said. We need to be more multidimensional. It's about creating a society that is, people feeling at home and at ease and feeling comfortable for personal pursuit, and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's just about, minor changes in the educational system. It requires a lot of deep thinking within Hong Kong society and among us. I mentioned this already, that, I think a lot of time our policy initiatives do not engage ordinary people. And that's why, quite honestly, recently we have a lot of discussions about how to get the talents. I mean, we all know, without going to that kind of discussion, is at the end of the day, the kind of talents that we have in mind are still talking about people with knowledge and really rare skills that in demand in the market. It's not really about a shortage of labor. It's not really about some kind of work which is very important or even meaningful, but we don't really want to pay them too well. For example, people working in the area of elderly care. When we say that, we have labor shortage, our immediate reaction would be import labor. The better even push the wage level even further down so that, we can ensure that ordinary elderlies would receive proper care and so on and so forth. But sometimes when I'm looking at this sort of development, I talk to myself and think, what if I turn out to be non-credential young person? I just finished DSE, not able to continue to pursue the university program, degree program. But somehow I find if I get the proper training and I'm going to work in, say, an elderly home, I can take care of them. It's not an easy job, sometimes being described as a sturdy job, but I think that it's quite meaningful. And along the way, I acquire skills, and then gradually, probably I would, do another certificate, diploma, whatever, to enhance my skill. I find it a meaningful life. What if I just want to do that? The blueprint, according to the government, do you have a lot of rooms for that? Do you really have suggestions that, this is kind of things that at the end of my career, I would be able to lead a decent life? I mean, reasonable salary, being respected, even though that most people would not like to take up that kind of job, but you would think that, okay, you are the person who really take care of the old people, and then I respect that, I appreciate. And have a sense of security so that I know I'm not the person to, as mentioned by Anthony, now we focus a lot on assuming everyone, you got to have your own business, you got to have your own employment, you got to have your own education degree, and then you also need to have your own property, domestic property. What if I end up, my salary can only afford me to apply for public housing? How would the society look at me? Of course, nowadays everyone would be quiet. No one would say that, we don't like you. Of course, no one do, I think. But at the same time, not many people would say that I really respect you having this sort of hope for yourself. So I'm just saying that, look, there are ordinary people. There are also ordinary people who can be heroes in this society. I mean, when you have a crisis, then you think, okay, people taking care of elderly, taking care of kids, continue to work in kindergarten, these are important people. But are you able to attract people, young people, to work in those areas, to take up the job and take it as their own mission? When we talk about mission, when we talk about life goals, we rarely touch on those ordinary aspects of people's hope. So quite honestly, I do think that, we need a lot of deep thinking about the institutional arrangements of this society. I think Anthony has opened up a broad agenda, because it's not just about whether you have your own business, get your own home, and so on. It's also about freedom of expression, the sort of life that you find comfortable, whether you find, this sort of expected values and morals that you find in Hong Kong. But I would like to push it even further that, I do think that we need to have a broader, deeper thinking about the institutional arrangement of a society, so that we have to admit, you like it or not the entire population would be the top 25% of the world. Of course, you can say, no, this is probably the Hong Kong vision, because Hong Kong is a global city. If you're not able to work in the top 25 income bracket, sorry about that. That's the end of it. You've got to find somewhere else. You retire somewhere else, because you won't afford to stay in this place. That's another possible vision. But the other thing is probably, no, this is a society that I'm afraid we have to work out a broader system so that any person with motivation, a willingness to try would find the way here. And this is the question I posed, that, you know, we need to reflect upon the question about what kind of city we want Hong Kong to become. So I'm hoping that, you know, when we discuss young people's hope and young people's policy initiatives, we can bear in mind that, you know, they are ordinary people, not just the top 25%, and also are many domains of our life require us to have deep thinking in order to make this, you know, a more humane society, I would say. Let me stop it here. Thank you very much.
Hoping that if anybody from the government is watching this, I think we should really have this think about what exactly a society is and how caring from the government will be, you know, it can be. And so over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much. Just checking. Agency. If there's one word, in my opinion, that summarizes the problems that Hong Kong has confronted and that the youth in Hong Kong are enmeshed with, are confronted by the dearth of, or the lack of access to, it's agency. Agency not just in the form of the right to vote, the right to change political structures and systems, or the right to entitlement to jobs and career pathways, but a fundamental sense of respect, of being heard, of being taken seriously as individual agents whose voices matter. That's not available in the status quo, and it hasn't been for so many years in the past and at present. And let me just start by saying that the past few years haven't been easy on Hong Kong, and especially Hong Kong's youth. I most certainly agree with both professors in noting that there's a crisis affecting our youth today, but there's often this temptation to attribute this to the youth. We say the youth are responsible, they are ignorant, they are foolish, and therefore they deserve X, Y, and Z. This kind of mindset has very conveniently shaped this deflection culture, where those in positions of privilege and power would say, well, the youth have to learn. Too bad, right? They have to deal with it. And yet in so doing, we neglect our complicity in ossified structures and systems that perpetrate inequalities, that perpetrate disenfranchisement, and that exclude as opposed to include. The structural problems that Hong Kong is confronting today are numerous, whether it be a dearth of industrial diversification, gross socioeconomic inequalities, and deep uncertainty over our political future as a city. That despite our closer integration with the mainland on a nominal and de jure sense, the actual sense of proximity and closeness with the mainland has not increased over the past decade. There remains a deeply, deeply rooted sense of skepticism, of wariness of the mainland, even though it is our country and we are a part of China. But there are also incidental problems, whether it be the 19 protests that culminated from all of these systemic structures, or indeed the pandemic and the measures that have been kicked into place and taken effect since then. So in my presentation today, what I'd like to do is essentially present a pyramid that I hope can encapsulate pithily the problems and the challenges that the youth face today and that undergird the youth crisis, as well as outline some prospective solutions as to what could be done. And there are 4 layers to this pyramid. The first is the foundational stagnation in Hong Kong's social, economic, and political structures. The second is the vast and rampant inequality, as typified by the Gini coefficient, but also more broadly speaking, the distribution of opportunities. The third is the systemic disenfranchisement and exclusion of minority voices, of youth voices that do not know how to navigate a system that is increasingly, predominated by barriers to entry. And finally, there's the identity crisis that strikes at the core of all of this. Who are we? Who am I? As Professor Lowe said just then, or as Anthony said, Professor Cheung said just then, what exactly is Hong Kong? Wherefore and whenceforth is Hong Kong? If we could find a pathway forward and navigate a positive vision, then these are in theory the end goals and objectives that we could indeed aspire towards. And I will try my best to outline pathways and directions that allow us to reach these end goals. But let me be very frank before starting upon the dissection here. It's not easy. And I'm by no means cherubic in asserting or deluded enough to think that achieving these end goals would be as easy as a walk in a park. We've got lots of parks, by the way, in Hong Kong that we should certainly walk in. But again, it's something that we're not necessarily aware of. And that, to me, is an analogy, more broadly speaking, for Hong Kong's story on the international stage. We still have many virtues and qualities and assets left, but no one's hearing about them. Not only because we're not telling the story effectively, but also because the story at large has been clouded and enshrouded by the past few years of turbulence and also of turmoil that's rocked our dear home. So let me just start with layer one, which is essentially on the question of stagnation. I'd like to begin with two anecdotes, actually. The first is a friend of mine who recently came back to visit for Christmas. Now, he's studying computer science at Stanford, very brilliant chap, went through the international school system in Hong Kong. So I said to him, naturally, are you coming back? And he gave me a pretty interesting answer. He said, well, Brian, look, I really like Hong Kong. I love this city to death, but can't find a job here. I say, oh, surely you're a computer science major. You can find a job here. We're in need of tech talents, experts, innovation, all of that. Insert a long, set of a rant and tirade from me trying to pitch to him his home city. How ironic. And then he said to me, no, there are no such jobs in Hong Kong because most of them are either in Shenzhen or, as he is currently in Stanford, you just go to California. You'd work in Silicon Valley, but Hong Kong has no Silicon Valley to absorb STEM talents, to cultivate homegrown entrepreneurship and startups. That's case study number one. And the second case study is a friend of mine who did a master's in public policy, and he's currently working in a large corporate firm in Hong Kong. And he said to me, look, Brian, as much as I'd love to make a living out of public policy, it's a bit oxymoronic. It's a paradox. And you know what? There was no refutation I could provide to that, because the public policy sector exists thanks to the goodwill and a largesse of talents and also veterans like both of the professors here. But frankly, it is not a lucrative sector. The think tank industry in Hong Kong is struggling and floundering. So the reality is it's not just those who are locked out of education systems who are forced to be segued into segmented into education institutions that may not equip them with the skills, but it's also high-skilled labor that finds Hong Kong, fundamentally deplete or devoid of opportunities for them. And that begs the question, why exactly is this the case? The obvious answer is that we're over-reliant upon public or particular sectors rather. The real estate industry, the finance sectors, high-end professional services like indeed law or alternatively surveying and accountancy and so on and so forth, that there's a dependence in the economic structure. This is a pretty apparent answer. What also must be asked is, why is that the case? Why, despite years and years of attempts at diversification and broadening the industrial structures of Hong Kong, have we failed? And we've seen that the undergirding causes are numerous, but firstly, that wages have stagnated and are stagnating in non-prestigious sectors. So naturally, you don't attract individuals that could find more high-paying jobs to enter into the industry, which means that you lower the bargaining power and the ability of workers in those sectors to negotiate for higher wages. Vicious cycle therefore follows. But also this prioritization of market-led designation of jobs and employment means that we've been sitting on our laurels as an establishment, as the government, for a long while, thinking that all we need to do is to collect tax revenue off the lucrative golden geese. And as for the other sectors, it doesn't really matter because we don't need to do them. We do not have to do them full stop, or so the assertion goes. Yet it is also that sense of complacency that's created foundational stagnation, that despite the nominal improvements in GDP per capita, and also the expansion in the total size of the GDP, the wages of the bottom 30%, 40%, 50% in Hong Kong have not improved, if at all, since 1997. That's the reality. That when we talk of Hong Kong at large, we must also remember that there are folks who find that their jobs and wages have stagnated for 10 years, for 20 years. How then could they feel a sense of agency and a skin in a game? Whose game is this, after all? Not necessarily theirs. So what's the solution? Well, the solution, I suppose, are two broad directions. And I think the first is essentially an active rethinking to Hong Kong's economic structure via a combination of state and private-driven reindustrialization. a pivoting in our industrial openings and offerings, and also fundamentally a mindset shift. To professionalize blue-collar work is something that sounds ideal in theory, but to do that, you need to engage in a paradigmatic shift, the kind of shift that took place in Germany in the aftermath of World War II, the kind of shifts that are currently being undergone in Scandinavian countries, where occupationally speaking, there's a form of bare egalitarianism at the very least, that we do not look down upon factory workers because they're guilds, because there are professionalization and qualification schemes for workers in those factories as well, because there are attempts to introduce a degree of parity between blue collar and white collar jobs. I completely agree with Professor Lowe just then when he said that, we can't just talk about education, we've got to look at the economic structures at large. But what underpins that is a very Weberian notion of a culture of discrimination, of an ethos that attempts to differentiate and signal difference and reinforce difference to the exclusion of those who cannot access that particular distinguishing feature. We've got to change that mindset, got to change that economic structure before we think about direction 2, which is indeed equipping our youth with the skills and knowledge to hustle, to slash, to straddle, to change industries. At an age of mechanization, of automation, it is no longer sufficient to be skillful and trained in one particular profession. It is instead a dexterity and ability to move horizontally between jobs, to maintain a multitude of jobs and occupational pathways, in my opinion, that can generate not just income and revenue for the youth, but also a degree of autonomy and flexibility. Now, cynics would call this essentially the casualization of work. But if casualization of work is the broader trend that is occurring around the world in developed countries and cities, and it's high time that we at least trained and equipped our youth with the ability to navigate the casualization of work as the new normal. Because in the absence of that, what we would see instead over the next 10 years, no matter how grand the plans are, how sweeping the statements are, how wonderful the slogans are, make Hong Kong great again or something, we're not going to be able to win back the hearts and minds of the youth who feel shut out of this economy, shut out of this structure, and unheard, uncared for. So that's layer number 1 in terms of the vision and the problem, so to speak. The second layer, and you'll notice that this is somewhat built upon the foundational stagnation, right? In my opinion, the housing problem is indeed closely related to, and it's to some extent predicated by the foundational stagnation. And anecdotally, there have been many folks who tell me that they don't want to earn higher wages because doing so would disqualify them from public housing. So in some ways, this idea that there's a constant public housing class that's stuck and entrenched in estates has not just to do with the economic structures per se, but also the micro incentives that mold individual behaviors on a fine-tuned level. And that's the link that I have towards socioeconomic inequality as a second problem today. Now, this is well litigated. If you look at the government notices, politicians' rhetoric, the mainland Chinese and Beijing officials' language concerning Hong Kong, you'll notice that land and housing and inequality have been at the central forefront of their conceptions of what went wrong with Hong Kong. So I'm not going to litigate all the exact economic problems or the solutions per se, but I'd instead like to ask a question. Why is this a problem? Why is not being able to access decent housing a problem? Why is wealth inequality a problem? Why is income inequality a problem? Why do we care? Why bother? And the answer to this, in my view, is probably best epitomized by someone whom I interviewed and spoke with on a visit to a caged home in Tsuen Wan. So that was around Bak Ho Gai, it's in central Tsuen Wan. And essentially, that was a sweltering day of in mid-2020, I believe, when we basically brought along a bunch of packages and gifts and went along to meet and greet this gentleman who is a 50-year-old or something living in the caged home. And he told me this. He said, Wang Sang, called me in Chinese, addressed me in Chinese, I don't have a stake in this society. I'm just waiting to die. But hey, I can't just die alone. I've got to die somewhere with a shelter. So let me do that here. I try to work, it ain't working. I tried to find a job, couldn't find, tried applying for benefits, didn't know how to use a system. That's the reality. The reality is that socioeconomic inequality saps away individuals' ability to develop stake and ownership in the system. It deprives us of mental health and well-being. it causes us to lose a sense of self-efficacy. And therefore, there's a vicious cycle. If you see yourself as a dependent, if you see yourself as needing help, you never want to help yourself. And whose fault is it? You might say it's the individual. Change the mindset, change the behavior, change your own welfare. You know, a very sort of Ayn Randian way of looking at the world. But that's not going to work in a world where the structural odds are stacked against you in terms of a mindset shift. So rather than, and this is the first proposal that I have, rather than thinking purely about giving goods and services, welfare packages, all of that, important, sure, we need to shift towards a mindset of equipping, a mindset of giving these individuals the skills, the resources to scale and climb the ladder bit by bit from the underclass of the dirt poor. And I do not use that with derogatory connotations, but as a sign of reflecting the way we semantically think about and narrate the experiences of these individuals. From these individuals, we need to lift them up to the working class. And from the working class, build a pathway that allows them to become, you know, a member of the sandwich class, eventually with a middle class on mind. And for the middle class families, we've got to prevent the backsliding into the lower middle class through mortgage crises, through indebtedness, through failure to find replacement jobs because they are displaced due to structural unemployment factors, as well as demonstrate to them that there is a way up the ladder, there is a means towards better progress. It can't just be about giving. It must be a collaborative process of equipping, so to speak. And the second comment I have here, as a non-housing expert, as a non-industrial policy expert, I do think that we need holistic rather than piecemeal solutions. We can't just focus and fixate over the number of houses and flats built, whilst paying no regard whatsoever to the quality of the housing. Because it is ultimately a combination of quality and quantity of housing that makes for self-esteem and a sense of dignity and a sense of ability to change the world and society for the better. Numbers alone are necessary, but insufficient. And that's sort of the second direction I'd like to highlight in relation to layer number 2. Layer number 3, disenfranchisement and exclusion. Now, I'd like to paraphrase a comment, if you will, both professors, excuse me for this, of a Facebook friend of mine. And hello, if you're watching, I hope you are. And this Facebook friend basically commented when I shared this link to this event that, don't you find it ironic that all of these public policy panels are always fronted by middle-class, well-off individuals with links to the establishment? Firstly, I think this is a misjudgment to some extent of the two veterans and titans here. But secondly, to answer your question, I do think policy discussions in Hong Kong today are indeed in dire lack of representativeness of individuals from disenfranchised groups. That chances are to make it to the policy discussion, it needed to be the case that you're at least moderately well off, can access the language that is adorned and valued as the so-called language of the intellectual class, and above all, possess some degree of wherewithal and self-efficiency to speak. And that's why most public policy discussions in Hong Kong, especially today, are indeed dominated, unfortunately, by members of the elite. This is exactly the point that Professor Low was making just then. And more than that, actually, the barriers to entry now, these days, are beyond just class-based. Understandably, from Beijing's perspective, it is concerned and quite concerned about what it takes to be, in 2019, an attempt at seizing power, at thwarting political control, at upsurging and upstaging, you know, its sovereignty over Hong Kong. And let me be very clear, I do agree that Hong Kong is a Chinese city. But on the flip side, what we've seen happen on a very grassroots and bottom level, okay, on the front lines of politics here in Hong Kong, is an over-politicization of everything. You know, we preface every presentation with slogans, slogans. Manifesto, pledges, 8 promises, 10 agreements, 29 bullet points. Hands up if you think that's interesting to you. Good, that's an honest audience. The reality is, we are not living in a society where public policy is engaging to the people, is accessible to the public, is available for understanding to those who are not politically connected or embedded within establishment structures. And you know what the tragedy of all of this is? That I firmly believe that it is in China's interest and Hong Kong's interest for politics to be more inclusive, emancipatory, encompassing. That is why, for a very long while, the Chinese government works very hard at engaging the civil society and working with the civil society by incorporating it into the government, the fold of the government. That's what happens in the mainland, you know? It's a very complex system of cooptation, negotiation, village and grassroots democratization paired with consultative and deliberative reasoning that marks the way governance works in the mid-tiers and also the grassroots tiers of the mainland Chinese government. But we do not have the same currently in Hong Kong, because frankly, in my opinion, there's an excessive fixation upon vetting and not enough consideration over how can we diffuse tensions? How can we make people trust the government? How can accountability not just be delivered, but be seen to be delivered? And I trust that there are many good folks working in the government today still, civil servants, political appointees. There are many folks who care for Hong Kong. And I do not agree with those who seek to besmirch their integrity. But the honest truth is, the establishment is unfortunately out of touch with 90%, 95% of Hong Kong. And to fix that, we need two things. One, far more egalitarian dialogue that focuses on trust building between the establishment and the people. Not dialogue in a form of talking down at someone, not dialogue in a form of lectures at a one-way street, tokenistic questions, Q&A, but mostly just a speech, but actual dialogues behind closed doors, empathy, hearing, listening. But secondly, depoliticization, in my view, is vital and key. Now, usually in academic literature, depoliticization is looked down upon. Hannah Arendt's like, the encroachment of bureaucratic state depoliticizes the public life and public sphere. That's bad. But in my view, in Hong Kong, depoliticization may well be needed because the opposite, the counterfactual right now that we see is everything is politicized. Okay? The playground funding is politicized. Do you fund a culture and arts festival? No, that's a political question too. What do you decide to spend your budget on for New Year's Eve? That's a political question. Do you decide to rock up to this birthday party or that banquet or that meal with this particular luminary? That's a political question. Why is it so political? Because it just is. How can that sort of public policy making discursive spirit be accessible to the ordinary masses? I don't know. I really don't know. But do I think depoliticization is possible? Yes, I do. Technocratization, meritocratization in the civil service and also the government in the mainland China from the era of opening up and reform. These are transitions that have clearly been undertaken over these years. These are changes that we can see to be compatible with different political systems that may not be fully Western liberal democratic. So I do not believe that depoliticization is impossible. What I'm saying is we can bring about depoliticization by crafting spaces where professional, technically neutral and robust language and discussions and debates can be held. And that's how we solve partially the problem of political disenfranchisement and also alienation. And I'm aware that I'm running out of time, but I'm coming now on to the final part of my discussion and also speech today, I suppose, which is essentially the identity crisis confronting Hong Kong. Who are we? Who are we now? Who are we today? What makes Hong Kong, Hong Kong? In my opinion, in my humble opinion, Hong Kong is best served to serve as the most international, progressive, and cosmopolitan city on Chinese soil. This is a motto that has long stood by us, that we have long stood by, and we must not change. The only changes we make must be in advancing and preserving this status. And the honest truth is, I think there's a lot that we can give. We have fantastic room for cultural exchange and international dialogue, spearheaded by the likes of Danny Yeung. We have room for pressing forward progressive changes in favor of queer rights and LGBTQIA rights. I'm looking at the works of Anna Wu as a pioneer on this front. There's sustainability and ESG, the greenification, genuine greenification, not just tokenistic greenification of our city and of the country at large. Looking at Christine, for instance, as a pioneer on this field, Christine Low. And finally, in my humble opinion, Hong Kong could be the best site for track to dialogue and engagement and exchange between the rest of China and the rest of the world. But all of that is predicated upon one very clear premise, that we do not give up on imagining Hong Kong as Hong Kong, Kwei Hong Kong. Of course, Hong Kong's a part of China. Of course, Hong Kong's a part of the world. But ultimately, Hong Kong is Hong Kong and not just any other mainland city. And I say that with no disrespect towards my counterparts and friends in mainland, whom I believe to be benign motivated, well-driven, well-intentioned. It's that Hong Kong's difference from the mainland is an organic part of one country. That's what people often forget. But that's also a story that I think needs to be said and told for all of us to remember. And on a more personal note, I've often been asked this question. Should I stay? Are you staying? Are you going? When are you going? When are you going? It's a great question. And I think it's a personal choice at the end of the day. There's no right or wrong answer. You could leave, you could go. You know, it's not Hotel California. You can check out any time you'd like, and you can in fact leave. But here's the thing. From my personal perspective, I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave because there's someone in the crowd right now who, you know, is currently at Cambridge and is running one of the largest non-profits for students in Hong Kong. Please stand up, Ethan. And he told me he doesn't want to leave this city. He believes in this city. I don't want to leave because I know a couple who started a wonderful venture, a co-working space. They want to be the largest and best co-working space and beyond, actually, collaborative working environment in Asia. Please stand up, Thomas and Susanna, if you'd like to. I don't want to leave because there are people like Trustin and Morgan who are university students who have given their careers and dedicated themselves to fixing Hong Kong and making this a better place. Please stand up, if you will, the both of you. Trustin as well, please. Yes? I don't want to leave because I believe that in Hong Kong, we've got the grit, we've got the integrity, we've got the spirit to be more than what we have been. But does that mean I'm blindly optimistic? Does that mean I'm sanguine without exception? No, of course I can't be. But we must be realistic whilst also harboring a little bit of illusional or delusional hope. Because that's what makes us human. Because that's what keeps us grounded. Because that's what makes us Hong Kongers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is really mind-blowing, and I'm really genuinely hoping that anyone from the government or any of you that are also really listening. And he's one of the youth, right? He's one of the young generation. So before coming to the question phase, if there's any questions from the floor, please raise your hand. Anyone who would like to ask or give you comments. Yes. And then I will reserve my questions later on because I would like to find the floor to ask the questions.
Hello, thank you so much to the three of you for your speeches. I have a I agree broadly with what you guys said about sort of this. Most youth, including myself, think the main problem with Hong Kong is that it needs systemic change. There are systemic problems that need systemic changes, and these are not happening. And there are obviously many reasons. And to me, I think one of them is that there are and again, you guys talked about incentives. Among the leadership structure, there's obviously the broader problem of a lot of them being out of touch. As Brian mentioned, a lot of them are not fundamentally in touch with the needs of the 95% of Hong Kong, especially young people. And there aren't any incentives for these leadership within, especially government, to create systemic change. If you're in a sort of democratic system, right, you have incentives because if you don't make some sort of change or if you don't address the needs of the population, you're voted out. Obviously, I don't think that's going to happen within the short to medium term in Hong Kong. So what do you guys have in terms of suggestions for incentivizing leadership, incentivizing people in politics currently in Hong Kong to address systemic problems and create systemic change when the incentives now currently are towards the opposite, towards maintaining the status quo and slowly climbing up the bureaucratic ladder and you know, 准时收工, if you will. How do you incentivize them? That's my question.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
First of all, I want to congratulate Professor Loy and Professor Cheung, because in Chinese we always say that only the poor go for teaching, and in the past, when people enter university, when they chose the faculty which they want to attend, the first one would be doctor, the second one would be law, and the third one would be engineering. And people want to study education are far behind the list. But now, congratulations, people who want to study, first of all, is doctor, second one, also law, the first one, also engineering. But the fourth one is try to be a teacher. So why have this change of attitude and mentality? I want to tell this one, this leadership. Because when Education University, under the leadership of Mr. Cheung, it turned people's mind, it changed the mentality. And of course, one most important thing is that when they graduate from the Education University, they earn more than $30,000. That is a very attractive salary. So to answer this first speaker, I can tell you influence is come from the leadership. If Hong Kong, the chief executive, have the mindset and ability like Mr. Cheung, the retired principal here, Hong Kong will have a very, very good change. So secondly, I want to introduce myself because I want to make some comments and observations. And also, before doing that, I want to ask the two professors several questions. Everybody agree that to have a good society, in particular, the youth are the most important pillar of the society. I understand that the government of Hong Kong now has tried every means to improve the quality of the youth. You can see that there's a very important post set by the government to lead the youth, try to educate them all. But you can see this leader is a Mr. Young. This Mr. Young, I have no comment about him. But this Mr. Young is grown from a green home. He never been poor before. He never in contact of the youth because he concentrated himself to helping his father to man his salary, his business. So why such a person can improve the training of the youth? I just ask any of the professor, how this man can improve the condition or to improve the mentality of the youth? Is it both of you agree that he have the ability?
Well, I personally don't know him, but I would answer your question in a way to respond to the first audience as well. I don't think we need to have someone who has been unemployed in order to address issues of unemployed workers, or we need to have someone who failed in public exams so that he or she would be able to take care of ordinary kids and so on. I don't know the person you mentioned personally, so I know nothing about the background and so on. But at the end of the day, I think that leads back to the questions that raised by the other friend, is exactly that, whether we have a system of the gathering of opinion as well as, like what you said, some sort of incentive. But in the present context, of course, it would not be a fully democratized electoral system. But still, influence of public opinion, the rebuilding of pressure group system, formulation of more articulate public debate, all this, I do think that would put people under the microscope so that there would be meaningful deliberation of whether that sort of policy initiative would be, impactful, whether this is a workable solution, and so on and so forth. I think we have gone through 3 difficult years, but it's far too early to have the attitude of resignation, saying that that's the end of it, and so that we don't need to do anything. In fact, I would say that we need to revive public opinion. We really need to revive public debate. We really need to revive open discussions so that we may not vote out someone, but still that person would be every day would need to encounter the public and need to address issues, because at the end of the day, if the proposed policy cannot deliver, and in the entire process it's been being criticized and questions being raised, I do think that it constitutes some sort of pressure. I don't think I can answer your question about that particular person, but I just like to say that, you know, we at the end of the day, we can't expect every single administrative officers in the government to say that you need to go through all the life hardships before you become a proper minister, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Professor Loy. But I don't think I would get a precise answer from you. So I don't make any question regarding to that side. And I also want to tell you that I get the key word from 3 speakers. The first one is paralyzed society. The second one is hope. And the third one is from Mr. Wong, recognition. So I use myself as an example what I see the youth problem in Hong Kong. I'm only a Form 5 student and only passed 5 subjects. In Hong Kong, I'm a Mr. Nobody. I work in a law enforcement agency for 45 years now. After retirement, I published 2 books, one with Mr. Professor Cheung, one by myself, quite popular. So I earn my living. I can have a very luxury, I can use the word luxury, retired life. I become known in the society. So because I'm Mr. Nobody, can go up like that, that is hope. Because when I grew from the secondary school, there's a lot of opportunity in Hong Kong. The society is homeless and full of activity. And everybody, even his peddler, hawker, can support his family to have a very lavish meal and good living. And a person who drives taxi can own 2 flats. So they are what we call the lam lang. They have a, if they work hard, they can have a very, very happy life. And the one who doesn't like lam lang, just like myself, join the government, and I can go up very high in the ladder. So there's a hope. And the second one is that the society, at that time, we do not talk about politics. What we do is try to work hard, and then we will have a rope to climb in the top of the ladder. And we have a lot of idols, you know, because Hong Kong by that time is run by administrative officer. They all high in their education, and people look at them as their future model. But now, if you look at Hong Kong government's so-called officials, they just lie, I can say, 小丑 in the public eyes. So how can they influence, I use the word influence, how can they influence young people when they grow up to become a leader in Hong Kong? But in nowadays, I can tell you, all the leaders in Hong Kong are become subject of a joke by public. You can see how they handle what we call the crisis. Now, second one is the freedom of speech. You just can see a professor in answer my simple question, they just beating the bush, I use the English word, without giving me an answer. Everybody knows Mr. Young, but you dare not to tell me. So that means Hong Kong has no freedom of speech. So how can Hong Kong people, I'm truly not believe. Mr. Wong said everybody want to stay in Hong Kong. And I dare to ask one question. Do you see any hope in Hong Kong young people? Can you answer me frankly?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Tell me, what is hope?
Hope is refusal to give in. Hope is the belief that change can come. Hope is the belief that is sometimes irrational. Hope is sometimes unfounded. But what is hope if it's founded on evidence?
That's all bullshit.
No, it's not. Because the future of this city is built through a combination of anger, of trust, of belief, of conviction, of the people, of the demos. And yes, times are changing. Political structures have changed. The patterns have changed. But my friend, do we live in the past? Do we live in the present? And do we change our future? I ask you. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the comments, and thank you, Brian, for the response. Yeah, and so we go on looking at another questions from the Zoom. How to encourage the elite sacrificing partial power to make room for the innovation from youth in grassroots. So any thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I will respond to this question as well as the point made by the first person during the Q&A. I think how can we inspire hope? How can we sort of, now we see a lot of things that we are not happy about. I mean, whether for young people or the not so young generation. Now, if I can try to summarize the kind of problem we are facing in general, I think we are in an increasingly divisive society. In terms of social division, using what Tai-lok just said, let's put it as 25% versus 75%, or during the days of the Wall Street Occupy movement, 1 versus 99. Okay, that's a kind of divisiveness. In terms of political division, right now in Hong Kong, I mean, Brian talked about over-politicization. And one aspect of politicization is to say, well, are you patriotic or you're not patriotic? Now, I'm not arguing against national identity and all that, but the way patriotism is being talked about in Hong Kong right now has got certain connotations. So I put it political division, patriotic versus the rest, that kind of division. And then you have the generational gap, the gender gap, the demographic gap. Now, the thing is, given all this gaps, divisions, how can we see a breakthrough? I think that's the point, right? How can we see, if we can see a breakthrough, if we can recognize the differences, we can see a breakthrough, that means there is hope. Not in the sense that suddenly everything has changed, but are we changing? And if we think that we are changing, we are seeking some breakthrough, then we gradually will put in more trust, confidence in the change process, and that will add to more hope. That's how I see it. So the thing is, are we now at the juncture of a turning point or a tipping point? So if I were the government, then I need to impress the population, well, we are changing. So what is the evidence of change in terms of those three aspects of divisiveness that I just talked about?
Well, I response to the comment or the questions just posed on the web. It's quite honestly, I don't think change would work out in this manner. I won't really work on the assumptions that we first need to fix the elite, first, so that they would sacrifice the power, and then in turn we would have innovation from youth in the grassroots. In fact, I think Hong Kong society itself, whether you think that everything is gone already, or rather that you would still work within Hong Kong society, we still have a very vibrant. Of course, whether you call it civil society, again, it is a matter of definition. But I would say that in Chinese words, it would be 民間, folks, civic society is still working. We still have NGOs. You are still able to set up your NGO and so on. I do think that initiatives from the people themselves would first help to support innovation from youth, not only in the grassroots, but from ordinary families. Anyone who is interested would have that possibility. You need to energize that part first, and then the elite and then the government, they would need to respond. That's exactly the first questions raised. What sort of things without a democratic electoral system would allow them to have the sort of incentive to make change? Is exactly that. Once you find yourself under pressure, once you find yourself you're out of the gender, people are talking about it without counting your role, then you need to respond. Same thing for the elite, same thing for the government. So that's why I would say that instead of following the steps like this, I would rather say let's energize youth in the grassroots first, and then they need to respond, and then they will respond.
Would you say two quick things on this? The first is that I think the elite masses dichotomy, as Marxist as that might sound, isn't necessarily the best way of conceptualizing complex infra-societal dynamics, because there's a mid-tier that we're missing here. Right? When we say bottom-up change and top-down, we seem to dichotomize the society into the top and the bottom. But what about those in between? And to me, the site for agency, for dislocation, for reform and progress comes neither from the top nor bottom. It comes from the in-between, the middle. And that's the core sort of middle stratum that connects and conjoins, as opposed to just embodying the status quo. And I don't actually buy the line that the middle class is inherently status quo preserving or petty bourgeoisie, which is again sort of the Gramsci way of looking at things. I in fact think that they are the most prospectively engageable and workable partners in advancing social reforms. And just secondly, as a means of working with the elite and working with the establishment, look, rules have changed, times have changed, and I think the adversarial politics that's practiced in Western electoral democracies, not judging, I'm not saying that's bad or good. I think that is a way that things work currently in the West. There are problems that also merits to that. That is not necessarily something that's applicable to the context that we're in today. So we've got to shift away from the adversarial and finding a way that's constructive, that's not just status quo preserving or shilling for and deferring to the established entrenched interests, whilst also navigating, of course, the quagmire of practical feasibility. So I, for one, would certainly not see angry shouting or sloganeering as a solution to working with the elite, because ultimately we've got to work with many groups of people, the elite, non-elite, and whatnot. And I know some folks would disagree. They say the politics of anger is what motivates social movements. Malcolm X, for instance, Frantz Fanon. I know the literature very well there, but I would just say that sometimes anger must be caveated and channeled in a productive manner. It may not always work out, but at the very least we may be tactical in so doing. So that's my broad answer there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I do see hope when I see that heated discussion, to be honest, because I thought that we were talking about whether there still be inclusion of different opinions and channeling anger and then responses, and we're still keeping, to what we stand for. I think this is actually one of the signs of hope when we're talking about inclusiveness, right? So now, I actually wanted to ask that question before the floor, but I just thought, as the host, I shouldn't do this. I should allow the floor and anyone who is on Zoom to ask the questions if there are still any. But then I was listening to all the speeches. I was really like, it's really mind blowing to me, because I I passed my youth. Now I'm in the middle age, and I passed through and the golden period of 1980s. Yeah, in between person, and I share a lot of the the feelings and the thoughts that I've never expressed myself in that, because I was actually grew up in the 80s and 90s when we said that Hong Kong was in the golden era, and now that our generation was blamed for not doing anything. And then when I looked at the survey, and actually we were talking about the blueprint, and I was wondering, like, has the government ever really listened to us? I watched a few movies that talked about going into the person's and becoming like, look who's talking, was talking about the babies, right? They're talking and we're understanding them. And then Mel Gibson's What Women Want, and then he suddenly changed to be able to, I think I'm listening to the women, what they're talking about. And then when I looked at all these public policy research funds, and then the recent Federation Youth survey, in fact, they, in the 2020, Professor Christine House and a few of us, we received a fund, and we worked on a project called Investigating Hong Kong Students' Aspiration for the Future. And that was actually funded by the Hong Kong government, by the PICO. And we actually wrote a report and expressed same thing, like 75.5% expressed concerns about maintaining core values of Hong Kong, particularly peace, harmony, and tolerance of difference. And over 80% university education is necessary to achieve despite occupation and future, similar to what Tai-lok and the rest of you's observation, thinking that education, university education is the road to success, right? And then they also talk about they want creative education and art, and then they use the word suffocating to comment on the current education system. And then when I looked at the Federation of Youth survey result, they talk about the kind of vision of good governance, having freedom, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and inclusion. Now, and then I look at the blueprint, to be honest, it doesn't really address any of these reports which have been funded by government or funded by some other foundations or NGOs. So I mean, it comes to my mind, like, how much does the government care about voices? How much do they really care? Or are they just doing or crafting this policy for the sake of having the stakeholders as the Chinese government? Or are they really listening to what you guys are talking about, or even the survey, or like other, or personal people's opinion, or even when we talk about the youth in the grassroots, about do they really care about them, or are they just doing their homework to please the government, the Chinese government? So I wonder how much will they engage, or do they engage in this kind of discussion? So if that's the case, what's the point of like discussing? Basically, that's my thought.
Maybe I can offer some perspectives. I'm not offering an answer to your question. Given my experience in government, given what I know about how governments, whether in Hong Kong, elsewhere, function. Now, for any government, when there is a problem, being recognized a problem, then you need to come up with some solution. And sometimes you don't know, you don't have a clue about the matter, or sometimes you do not yet have a full answer. So in a way, the so-called policy is a story in process. So it's not completed, or maybe you have misjudged the issue, but still you need to come up with something. You have to be seen to be doing something. So you have that kind of pressure, that kind of burden on you. And then but for any government statement, whether here or elsewhere, you need to impress people that, yes, we have got a solution. And here is it. We've got some functions, activities that will support the themes, the solutions. But again, it's out of being coerced to do something. that may or may not be fully addressing the problem. So what I would propose, if we look at it from a community perspective, I don't care what government is trying to do. Just impress on us certain that you are able to begin to turn the tide. So that turning point, I think, is important. And that's why I said earlier that, okay, if we are in a situation of being socially so divisive, politically divisive, or in terms of generational gap being so significant, are we able to tell people that, yes, we recognize such divisiveness, which is preventing us from working together, which will not be giving hope for certain section of society, but we are beginning to change. So this sense of seeing that change is coming, even though the change at this point is not so significant, I think that in itself is a basis for some hope. So for example, in terms of social divisiveness, using what Tai-lok just said, can the government begin to say, well, we are addressing the problem of ordinary people, ordinary young people, ordinary elderly people. Remember the recent incident in the UK when the Prime Minister talked to someone being unemployed and said, are you interested in working in banking? And that guy said, yes, I may be interested, but right now this is not my most important thing. So in other words, how can government be seen as really talking to the 75% issues? In terms of political division, instead of asking all the time, are you patriotic? Are you this? Can we have a different way of dealing with the problem, dealing with national identity and so on? Generational gap, maybe have younger people in the jobs, in consultative committees, in the government team, so that people feel that, well, there's less cognitive gap between us and them. I think these may be some starting points that might be useful.
Can I just supplement that very quickly? I have a slightly different take on the situation, which is if the government is indeed the bottleneck, if it were, okay, hypothetically, if it were, I would say, let's bypass it. If you see a rock, right, and there's a river, we don't need to have to, we have to slam into the rock, right? Ham-fisted or whatever, we can just bypass it. I reckon the private sector, I reckon that the society that we have, civil, uncivil, whatever you call it, it falls upon us to basically make change happen. When it came to the fifth wave, for instance, which was an absolute tragedy in the early months of 2022, I think many of us here would remember the fifth wave. I'm sure many folks in the government had their own struggles, and I don't want to just cast blame and say, let's fault all of them, they're all evil people. That's too simplistic and naive. But I would also say that that was when the private sector, the corporations, the NGOs, the MNCs, in Hong Kong, they played their part. And that's what makes Hong Kong so beautiful, that we still have, a private sector, an enduring non-profit sector. There are issues, there are problems, there are troubles, but at the end of the day, if there are policy proposals that the government is unable to process, reticent to process, as long as it's within the law, I reckon, we should just go ahead and do it ourselves, because that's the can-do spirit that's mapped Hong Kong for decades. And uniquely, we've got the capital, we've got the ability, we've got the land. So what are we waiting for? Let's do it. But of course, even when we're talking about cases where the government is needed, engaging the government is itself, I think, a form of art that varies from government to government, country to country. In some systems, an open, advocacy-centered, election-oriented approach is the best way of doing it. Lobbying is another means of going about it. Look in America, look at the UK, and I think these are systems that work, right? They have worked for centuries, at least many decades, and they've worked in creating many opportunities for people living in the West, living in Europe, living in these countries. But here in Hong Kong, given all that's changed and all that's occurred to this system, things might have, again, to work differently. We've got to reroute ourselves and rewire ourselves. Now, is it a form of navigating a really uncertain new normal? Yes, but I also think that navigating this normal was part and parcel of the political life, a political life that's defined by precarity as opposed to certainty. And after all, what's a political life with certainty but boredom and tedium? So that's, I guess, my overarching response there. And
the vision for how we can provide hopes and also to connect the government and the youth. My question is more about the front line. How can we finish the last mile between the policy and also the field? How will the youth be engaged? A few comments from my own background. I'm an anthropology student, so I conduct the majority of my ethnography in the field while engaging with youth. Earlier we've discussed the big words and the buzzwords in the policy usually are not easily understandable for the youth particularly. So sometimes they need to be translated into words and bite-sized volume so that the youth can actually engage with these activities. But who are the people that's going to lead in these activities? Are we going to expect the current system to outsource all the responsibility to conduct these activities in the hands of NGOs? What is the responsibility of everyone in this society to be engaged in the youth matter? Everyone's been a youth somehow. Like we've all passed through this rite of passage of our life to end up where we are today. How come people suddenly turn their back or turn a blind eye on the youth issues in their community? How can we properly engage different members across the community, say in a low-income community, in a mid-income community? How can we engage different members to participate in the activities that we are planning to help out the youth, so that we no longer put all the weight and the burden to accomplish these tasks in the hands of the awfully pressured and stressed social workers, but also truly to investigate this issue from a much more involved participation across the society. Thank you.
I tend to think that there would be multiple ways, and I would not expect, say, NGOs or different kinds of societies to take up that last 10 miles role in exactly the same manner. And I do think that, if they can maintain a diverse profile, would actually help to engage young people. One of the problem about current policy is that, if you notice in the past few years, gradually we develop some buzzwords, big words, and then everyone stick with it and just repeat it without grappling with the exact meaning of what are you talking about. For example, now everyone is talking about social mobility, as if, if you set up a buddy program, you set up a mentorship program, then you would trigger upward social mobility. But everyone understands that, if social mobility is something so simple, or poverty relief is something so simple, there would be no poverty issue in this whole world. I mean, everyone turn into buddy, and then we save the world. Same thing about GBA, Bell and Roll, etc. Are there opportunities there? Of course there are. Would it be good for young people to reach out and have a feel about what are the opportunities there? Of course. But at the same time, we also understand that in mainland, now every year we have more than 10 million university graduates, right? So who is going to discuss with our young people about, so where's your competitiveness? So what are you ready to do? What sort of thing you're looking for? And what are the expectations from the government, saying these kids, would we send our best kids to GPA to compete, or rather that, the least competitive ones go there? So what exactly is that ball game? Of course, some people will say that it is not about making money, it's not about short term, it's about contributing to motherland, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But, but what's that project? So quite honestly, for me, I mean, if we really want to do the last part of that process, do it well, I do think that we need to translate all these things into something understandable operationalized and make it doable, so that young people would think that, you know, you are really offering something that I can manage, or I can deliberate on it and I can decide to do it or otherwise. Otherwise, I mean, we were young previously, of course, but when we were young, of course, we were quite annoyed by all those empty promises and silly words as well. So I know it sounds, I don't know, you know, old school, and at the end of the day, you know, you just need to be down to earth, right? In order to convince people that, you know, you're actually talking to them.
Maybe I'll tackle your question from another angle. And to do that, let me tell a short story. In the late 1980s, I was invited to Guangzhou to give a talk about civil service system in the West. At that time, on the mainland, it was about reform and opening up, learning from the West. So I talked about the civil service institution, the neutrality of civil servants, the need for meritocracy, and so on and so forth. And then after my talk was over, when we chatted, the participants, so those participants, mostly, they were officials in charge of personnel matters. So one official came to me and said, Dr. Cheung, what you talked about makes a lot of sense. However, I doubt if our elders will listen to us. Now that cadre talking to me was probably in his early 60s. At that time, I was in my late 30s. So when he talked about his elders, and you can imagine who were making the decisions, right? So, I mean, in every generation, we have that kind of frustration. We are not listened to, and we think that what we are doing is right. Now, as I grow older, I hesitate to think that what I think is always right. But I think we are not assuming that there's always a simple answer to questions, to problems. However, I think in the process of finding a solution, every sector wants to be listened to, wants to be heard. I think that's important, and you have to impress them that they're being heard. And we are not talking about instantly coming to the ideal world. So if you use the phrase walking the last mile, it's as though that after this last mile, then we reach the end of history. Then we are getting everything right. I don't think that's how the world functions. Maybe that's not the way God makes it function. However, we have to assume, now we have to accept that we are in a complex society, different sectors, a rather diverse society. But the important thing is not turn diversity into polarity, so polarized, that we don't listen to each other. Now, the less polarized society is, the more willing every society will be to have other people's views heard. Government documents, I think, unavoidably has the burden of being quite conforming to a certain mode. And you find a lot of bureaucratic or administrative speak. you find all the buzzwords fashionable at the time for political reasons, for other reasons. I think that's not the most important thing. I've come to a stage where I go beyond the document. And I doubt if many young people will read the blueprint. However, even if they don't read the blueprint, the important thing is how do government reach out to young people of different views, different backgrounds, the 25%, the 75%, and so on and so forth. So it's the interaction itself, which is so important, the reaching out, not just the formal activities, but still, yes, government needs to organize activities. But I think it's the attitude of listening to people, and there's the impression that it's not just listening, but certain things do happen after talking to government. I think that will begin to change the young people's perception of being impotent, the word I used earlier in my presentation.
if I could just add one last thing, which is essentially the importance of skin in a game. You know, the youth today are rightfully concerned. They're rightfully asking, what's my stake? What's my skin in the game? And in all honesty, if the game that's being played here is so exclusionary because the barriers to entry are so high, then you're not going to get everyone being willing to walk the final mile because they're not able to walk the final mile. We've got to create that space for the final mile to be walked by all as opposed to the few. And that to me requires, again, depoliticization, reduction of barriers to entry in terms of wherewithal and resources, and most fundamentally, a sincerity and a security to say, you know what, I may not agree with you youth politically. Come one, come all, let's have a chat, let's grab a pint, let's talk through it. You know, I'd much rather see more sort of heated exchanges like what we had just then than, you know, a bunch of, oh, you're amazing, you're so beautiful, sort of sycophancy. That's not how public policy making should work, ideally. But it does happen to be the case sometimes in some places, you know, so yeah.
Okay, any other questions from the floor? Yes. I think we can take one question. Any other questions perhaps from the floor? Any other questions? If not, this lady.
Thank you. Thank you for the speeches. My question gonna touch on what kind of opportunity that we will give the young people. What is the bottom line, especially when it comes to political sphere? On one hand, we said the future is in the young people's hand. But what if the young people and the not so young generation, they want different thing of the society? I feel like because I was born after 2000, just graduated, very much of a youngster that the city is talking about. So I feel like whenever we talk about a generation problem, it's a generation thing. Like I feel like different generation, they have their own difficulty they are facing. Like my father or my grandparents, they was born in the post-war era, then maybe they care most about is the city's economic growth. But nowadays, the young people, we are referring to the millennials or Generation Z. Those people are living in post-modernization era. We grow under full of love, full of information and freedom. So we grow very differently and we want different things. And such change we can see also all over the world. We see environmental activists commit vandalism in the museum, calling for climate change. So they care topics mostly about gender, environment, race, and so on, because they value universal values. And so what constitutes a better world cannot simply by giving them a flat or economic stuff. So back to Hong Kong, we see throughout the free democratic protests in 2014, 16, and 19, they are asking for democratic change, even challenging one country and two system, rule of law. Actually, they didn't mean to challenge the system at first place, but however, they are disappointed again and again. So they start to question, is such system still reliable and sustainable? Or is that something that we want in the future? And young people, they are asking for freedom of speech, gathering information, and political rights. And because they feel like these values are that this is the stuff that make Hong Kong successful. So they want to preserve this stuff. So back to my question. If they want something which is different from the elder generation, what is the bottom line of that opportunity?
Thank you for that question. Look, I completely agree with you that we can't just reduce everything that's happened in Hong Kong to a very materialist way of looking at history. You know, there's post-material values, Engelhardt, robust literature on that. And to a large extent, I certainly think there's a plurality of demands and non-reducible to one another. That's why the pyramid that I profit there had identitarian and also political efficacy and agency as separate tiers, because you can't subsume one into the other entirely. What I will nevertheless say, though, is 3 quick observations. The first is that whilst it is implausible and empirically incorrect to collapse post-material pursuits into material demands, how much of the post-material pursuit there is rooted in material angst? That's the question I have, number one. So imagine a hypothetical world where there is genuine mobility, there's genuine chance at egalitarianism and space for organic growth and cultivating your own careers and flourishing without electoral democracy in a way we see it or imagine it. How much of the public or the mass would indeed be satisfied in that counterfactual? I don't think it's the entirety of them, but I think it's a significant portion of them that would feel that the government and the establishment, as you said, actually works in that counterfactual. But the sad reality is we're not there. We're not living in that world right now. So we've got to work towards that. So I think the first answer to your question is that if we want to reconcile across generations, we've got to find common ground and find ways of interpreting room for synergy between them. And the second answer is a more practical modus vivendi or operandi, I suppose, is again, dialogue and action following on from dialogue. Generations often disagree over priorities, over what they think is important, over what they see as true even, and over who they see as the enemy or friends. But I think the answer there rests with humility, and that's why the elite, the aged elite, seasoned elite, we've got to reach out. They've got to reach out and talk and incorporate, as opposed to indeed blocking and shutting folks out of the system. And as for the baseline question, I think there are baselines that we can change, and then there are baselines that we can't change, and then the baselines that we definitely can't change. My principle and suggestion is always that we try and stretch and expand as much as is possible the baselines that can actually be stretched. And then where we can't stretch them, we accept them and learn to navigate them in exchange for greater freedoms in other areas and spheres. Sounds a bit abstract, but I guess that's just the answer to the baseline question that you were proffering or prodding at just then. Thank you.
Talking about baseline, I don't know whether I would understand you perfectly. I presume it means, okay, this is my bottom line. If I'm not getting to it, then either I will withdraw, I will disengage, I give up hope, I don't see there's any future. So in other words, anything above the baseline, the bottom line, might be positive so that people will begin to engage. Now, I agree with Brian that we seldom find a situation where everybody agrees with the others, even among young people. I mean, you have young people who say this, some people who say that, some will say housing is most important, others say, well, sorry, we are not just after material benefits, we want this and that. And that is normal. And in reality, it's difficult to have a policy in any policy domain that is able to be a policy for all seasons or for all sectors. It's difficult. However, it is important that in the process of generating that policy, every sector feels that they are somehow heard. And you can see a bit of things coming from that process of dialogue. And the policy itself can give people the impression that every policy is evolving. In other words, it's adapting to changing situation, that the policy is sensitive to those changes, which may not be obvious now, but maybe in future, when changes, external changes become more apparent, then the policy is able to adapt. I think we want that kind of policy. We don't want rigid policies. Now, unfortunately, in Hong Kong and in any place in the world, you cannot get away from what I may describe as a structural limitation. Now, when I was a secretary in the government, sometimes I talked to my civil servants, and I said, we have a generational problem at both ends. So we are at the in-between age. So we do not fully understand what young people want. At the same time, we do not fully appreciate what elderly people are facing. So sometimes when we formulate policies, we use our own experience. For example, for baby boomers, we say, oh, yes, life was so tough, poverty after the war, and we got through. So why can't young people nowadays not getting through what they are facing? Or we feel that we can walk, we can do this and that very comfortably, we do not imagine once you get, oh, you have this problem, that problem. So in other words, any government official involved in the policy process, no matter to what extent, they need to be aware, they need to be more sensitive to the needs of different sectors, different generations. So the bottom line, I think, is we have to move on so that people will not feel that, sorry, we are shut up, so why don't we just withdraw? We don't want that kind of withdrawal syndrome in our society, because that cannot nurture hope.
Okay, very quickly. Some 15 years ago, I think I wrote a small book, somehow touch on the issue of generation. And since then, around 2007, people ask me, what's the things that young people need to do? My answer is always that, first of all, no matter which generation you belong to, you talk to people of your own generation. I don't think that, there's only one opinion on doing what is right, what is wrong. Even among people of the same generation, they have different opinions. And is there proper dialogue? Is there proper discussions among themselves so that they work out something all agreeable? I think it's important. No one can claim that, I'm coming from that generation, so what I think is supposed to be good, so I represent everyone. So every single one person from that generation should follow my footsteps and do that kind of thing. So a proper dialogue among people of the same generation, I think, is the first step towards reaching out what is the bottom line. What is your bottom line may not be another person's bottom line. The second thing is, don't ever use the term ends justify the means. Don't ever think that, I'm now working for the good of the planet. I'm working for the good of the universe. I'm working for the good of the entire world. And you thinking that I'm silly is only because you are reactionary, you are not, updated, you are not well informed. So you're not eligible to talk to me, you must follow. I don't follow this kind of Leninist logic, that someone represent the universal view, and because I'm good, I'm a true believer, so everyone, single person have to be a true believer like me. I think this is very, very dangerous. Thirdly, there's always discussions about strategy, tactics, and so on. If you want to achieve certain things, there are steps. You can't just say that because I'm a true believer, I'm working for the good of the universe, so I must be right, no matter what I do. Whether I make a world-famous painting dirty, it's good. Even if you don't agree, you have to stay quiet. I don't think it should work like this. People can criticize you. And in fact, unfortunately, people can punish you because you violate law and so on and so forth. And so you need to work out, if I want to make change, what are the steps? What are the steps that people would follow, thinking that is sensible, and they would understand? If you are adopting a strategy that at least half of 50% of society think, I don't agree, I think this is a disruption, then you need to think. You can't say that, hey, look, I'm supposed to be good for you. How come you're pulling my legs? I think that everyone, whenever we want to make change, we need to work out, this sort of thing and make it an open thing for discussion among people of the same generation. And that's how I see it. Thank you.
Very much for everyone who are here and those who are on the Zoom. And thank you so much for the speakers here today and giving very thoughtful and thought-provoking discussions. And so I announced that the next Policy Dialogue series, the next episode will be on February 11, and it will be after Chinese New Year. And the topic will be Hong Kong and the world, still connected and valued internationally. So we have the same gang here. We're going to be present and stay tuned. It's going to be another heated and very, very invigorating discussions. Okay, so see you guys next time. Okay, and have a wonderful Chinese New Year. Okay, thank you.